good evening, Carol.
Well, good to have you with us. I mean, there were quite some scenes in the Oval Office. What do you make of that confrontation?
Well, it's unprecedented, maybe. That might be a stretch. It was sort of a Zelensky type moment. Many of us were anticipating a confrontation, but the idea of bringing it into an extra dimension of having a video stream of these protests and Julius Malema mouthing off were probably unexpected surprises in this confrontation.
Well, let me ask you to explain some of the background to this, because many people, perhaps before this confrontation, may not have been particularly aware of what's going on. We have had these claims of a genocide against white farmers. There have been one or two high-profile killings. How serious is the problem in South Africa?
Well, look, South Africa is no stranger to violent crime. It happened during the time of apartheid. It's happened since. It remains a challenge in South Africa in many ways. And the numbers don't demonstrate that there's a singling out, if you would, of a white community or white farmers for that matter. In fact, most of the farmers that have unfortunately been murdered have been black farmers or people of mixed race. I think the idea here is that you can certainly peel away from that community of murdered farmers and see a collection of white farmers. Surely that is the case, and that's the sort of argument that President Trump has rested his case on. But it is, I don't think South Africa can run away from the fact that there is a lot of crime and that farmers have been targeted in part because of their remote locations and the fact that there isn't often security available in and around those distant farms.
And what about this program of repatriating land to many of the black community whose ancestors had the land taken from them in the past?
Well, there's an historic injustice in South Africa that goes back centuries. This will not be addressed overnight. There's certainly a feeling of inequity among many and most Black South Africans that they are landless, and the fact that they remain landless, that the majority of agricultural land is still held in white hands. But I
What
do
about
think
these claims then that white South Africans are actually being driven from their lands, that the land is being seized and handed over to others?
certainly there are isolated instances where farmers are driven from their land. I think that was even mentioned during the dialogue with Retief Goosen, who is, as you know, a famous golfer. There are instances where this has happened. But the South Africans will contend, and I think with some justification, that there are constitutional protections against land seizure and criminality that will prevent this from being other than the occasional isolated incident. So surely it has happened. People have left because of fear. But I do think that there are constitutional protections that this will prevent it from being a wide-scale phenomenon.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned some of the high-profile white South Africans who were there in the room, and you've had, I think it's at least 60 white South Africans who've been granted asylum in the US. I mean, why do so many of them want to go there?
Well, I mean, I think it certainly boils down to opportunity as well. I think that I have often thought that perhaps the best way to handle that exodus, a small exodus, if you would, of white farmers, is that we're sorry to see them leave. We're trying to work together in combating these challenges of crime. But of those people who choose to leave, we're sorry to see them leave. But we don't think this is going to represent a large number. And I think the polls in South Africa will suggest that there aren't a lot of farmers ready to leave their farms and emigrate to the United States. But certainly there is a number, and 50 does not make a huge number. It's certainly a nice photo op, if you would, to see them arrive at Dulles Airport. But I don't think this represents a groundswell of support among the South African white farmers.
There are a whole host of other issues, aren't there, on which the United States and South Africa take very different views. The US has been angered by South Africa's role in the case against Israel at the International Criminal Court, and a whole host of other things. How bad do you think relations are between the two countries, perhaps not helped by tonight's meeting?
Well, I mean, they've been on the rocks for a while. I think there's been, opportunities or finger pointing on both sides for the decline in our relationship. What I thought was very interesting in the discussion today, if you would call that, was when the issue was raised on the ICJ case, President Trump declined to really comment, saying, we'll see what happens there on the judgment. It struck me as unusual because much of the focal points of this relationship with the United States has circulated around the issue of the ICJ case, certainly in Congress, where you've seen a bevy of congressional letters complaining about the ICJ case.
You're talking about the International Court of Justice case against Israel.
That's correct. And then when that was raised in the Q&A by one of the journalists, the president sort of pushed that off and saying, well, we'll see what happens with that. He didn't jump to that and saying, well, we really disagree vehemently with South Africa on that case. We wish you would withdraw it. I just thought it was very interesting that he passed on that issue, because that certainly has been a serious point of contention among members of Congress and South Africa. And that goes back since the filing of that case.
What about the Elon Musk factor? Elon Musk, who, of course, the billionaire who now, I still think, for the time being, has a role in the administration heading the Department of Government Efficiency, a close ally of President Trump's. He's been trying to get his Starlink system up and running in South Africa, but is struggling because of this requirement that there should be 30% ownership of much of the kind of companies that would operate this. Elon Musk himself, of course, is South African born. How significant do you think his role could be in all of this?
Well, certainly he's been very much in the background on fomenting this sort of dispute between the United States and South Africa. He certainly has been a proponent of declining relations. I think he's trying to use this as leverage to get his Starlink in. He certainly has taken great issue on the BEE, the Black Economic Empowerment requirements of up to a 30% equity ownership by South Africans. But there are other means in which you can attain these thresholds. And I think there's, from what I've heard, a deal being worked out that in lieu of having equity ownership by South Africa, that Starlink will provide its services to rural schools, which in effect would offer sort of quality points that they will attain a certain BEE status without necessarily having to sacrifice equity. And it's always been my opinion that the BEE requirements for foreign investors to attain that local equity ownership has always been a detriment to foreign investment. So he's not alone in having queries on that requirement.
So finally, and just briefly, if you can, where do you think this leaves relations between the two countries? Clearly, they did go on to have some discussions away from the cameras. Do you think that perhaps many South Africans watching will have been angered by this?
Well, I think they would justifiably be angered, but I thought it ended on a better note.
Oh,
we got through that, and we can move on and look at some of the more detailed issues pertaining to trade, security cooperation, maybe even a restoration of development assistance in the health area. I think there's a whole slew of opportunities to have a meaningful bilateral discussions on these other issues. And we'll see what the reports coming out of that will be in the coming days. Anthony
Carroll from the Carnegie Africa Programme. Great to speak to you on the programme. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Carol.